They called it the greatest invasion in history. The beaches of Normandy were filled with tanks, trucks, jeeps, steel and courage rolling onto French soil. But 10 days later, most of those machines sat still. Their engines coughed once, then died, and the men began to realize what no one had dared to say aloud: they were running out of fuel. "We landed with rifles, tanks, and dreams," one American logistics officer wrote. But without gasoline, all that metal was just scrap. In early June 1944, Allied High Command celebrated the success of D-Day. But in the backrooms of supply depots from Portsmouth to Southampton, panic simmered. Each day, the advancing armies needed over 3 million liters of fuel, for tanks, trucks, ships, aircraft. Every drop had to cross the English Channel in metal drums or by tanker ships, both of which were slow, vulnerable, and constantly targeted by German submarines. The war machine had moved faster than its own lifeline. A British engineer named Geoffrey Lloyd put it bluntly during a tense staff meeting: "We've built an army that can't move without petrol. And petrol that can't cross the sea." Someone laughed, the bitter kind of laugh that comes when disaster feels too absurd to be real. Another officer said, "Then perhaps we'll ask the Navy to bottle the Channel." The room fell silent until a thin man in oil-stained overalls spoke. "What if," he said carefully, "we don't move the fuel over the sea, but under it?" The idea hung there, impossible and magnificent. A pipeline under the ocean. Within hours, the thought became a memo, and by nightfall it was a file on the Minister of Fuel's desk marked Top Secret, Project Pluto, short for Pipeline Under the Ocean. The first reactions were almost comical. Admirals scoffed. Generals called it lunacy. "The sea will tear it apart within an hour," one shouted. But the engineers didn't laugh. They just nodded, already sketching diagrams in their notebooks. Barnes, an older Shell petroleum specialist, traced a finger across a map from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. 70 miles, he murmured. "If we can make a pipe flexible enough to bend with the currents, the sea will protect it, not destroy it." That night, while bombers droned overhead on their way to France, workshops across southern England glowed with lamplight. Men and women in coveralls tested small sections of pipe in tanks of salt water. Most cracked or leaked within hours. The salt corroded joints, pressure burst the welds. But each failure taught them something new. By dawn, a handwritten note was pinned to a wall above the test bench. "If we can fuel one tank, we can move an army." The stakes were brutal. Without gasoline, tanks couldn't advance, jeeps couldn't deliver ammunition, landing craft couldn't return for reinforcements. Victory would starve on the beaches. The invasion that promised to end the war could stall before reaching Paris. And yet, in a strange irony, the solution was not more firepower, it was plumbing. The plan called for two kinds of pipelines, one made of steel sections welded together, another designed like an electric cable, with a lead core wrapped in layers of steel wire and tarred canvas. They would lie hidden beneath the channel, invisible to German reconnaissance. Fuel would flow from the refineries in southern England, through underground storage tanks, straight into the veins of the invasion. A young officer in charge of logistics wrote in his diary, "Every war has its miracle. Ours won't explode. It'll hum quietly, beneath the waves." But first, they had to build it, in total secrecy, with the enemy less than 100 miles away and the tides against them. To hide the project, they disguised their test rigs as telephone experiments, their warehouses as cable factories. Local workers were told they were producing marine communications equipment. Only a handful of people knew the truth, that the future of the war depended on a tube of steel and lead lying silently under the sea. Even Churchill was intrigued. When briefed on the concept, he smiled and muttered, "Let's give the Hun a surprise they can't bomb." By late 1943, the first prototypes were being tested in coastal waters. The engineers watched the gauges as pressure built, 500 pounds, 600, 700. The pipe trembled but held. A cheer went up. Then, an hour later, a violent hiss, and the entire section burst open, sending a jet of oil 50 feet into the air. They cleaned the deck in silence. Someone said, "Back to the drawing board." Another muttered, "Or the grave, if we fail." The sea didn't care about their deadlines. Each wave was a reminder that this experiment belonged to forces older and stronger than any army. But the engineers refused to stop. By spring, after countless sleepless nights and more than a few close calls, they had something that worked. A flexible, pressure-resistant cable thick as a man's arm. It gleamed under the lamplight, smelling faintly of tar and victory. One of the technicians, a young woman named Margaret who had joined the project from an electrical firm, wrote home. "Father, we're building a highway made of fuel. When it's done, it will feed every tank that frees France." The message never passed the censors. But the dream inside it moved quietly, like the current below the channel, unseen, unstoppable. No one outside a handful of rooms knew that in the next months, the fate of Europe would depend not only on soldiers, but on a secret pipeline, the lifeline of an army trapped between the sea and the enemy. And as the first coils of steel began to roll onto the docks, someone whispered the project's unofficial motto. "Victory runs on fuel. And fuel runs under the sea." Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The workshop smelled of oil, sea salt, and sleeplessness. In the autumn of 1943, long before the invasion, Britain's hidden factories worked through the night under blackout curtains. The workers didn't wear uniforms, only overalls marked with oil stains and secrecy. What they were building was too strange to explain, a steel artery meant to carry the lifeblood of an army beneath an ocean. In one warehouse near Southampton, an engineer named William Hamilton stood beside a prototype coiled like a monstrous serpent. To lay a pipe across the channel, he said to his team, "We must make steel behave like rope, strong enough to bend, light enough to float, and stubborn enough to survive the sea." They called the design HAS, a cable-like pipe with a lead core and steel wires wrapped around it in tight spirals. Another team across the country worked on Hamel, made of welded steel sections. Both were experiments in controlled madness, inventions that had to withstand not only pressure, but war itself. The early tests were humiliating. Pipes buckled under their own weight, joints burst, and the first full-length trial in shallow water ended with an explosion that sent a column of crude oil into the air like a black geyser. "The ocean doesn't want us here," Hamilton muttered. But he and his crew went back to work. Every failure made the idea more urgent. Each day without success meant another delay for the invasion. Churchill himself demanded updates. "If we can't refuel our armor," he wrote in a memo, "we'll end this war with bicycles." Inside the labs, engineers measured pressure with trembling hands. They heated the lead sheath, tested its elasticity, cursed the salt that corroded their welds. The ocean was patient, they could not be. Archibald Fraser from Shell Petroleum became the project's quiet center, a man with the calm of a scientist and the eyes of someone who hadn't slept in weeks. He spoke softly, almost to himself, "A machine's worth nothing without fuel. We are building the invisible part of victory." Outside, the war thundered on, bombers leaving trails over London, ships burning in the Channel, but inside these walls, the real war was against physics. The most dangerous test took place on a cold night in February 1944, at the edge of the Isle of Wight. They connected a section of HAS pipeline to a massive generator, pumping water through it at full pressure. The gauges trembled, the pipe groaned. At 1,500 psi, one of the bolts gave way with a sound like a gunshot. Men ducked, shouting. Steam hissed into the dark. Then silence. The section held. Someone clapped. Someone else laughed, not out of joy, but relief. After 100 failures, they had a survivor. In a small diary found years later, one of the technicians wrote. "When it didn't burst, we just stood there, staring at it. You'd think we'd won the war already." The next challenge was far greater, not building the pipe, but moving it. To cross 70 miles of water, it had to be wound onto enormous steel drums that could unroll the line like thread from a spool. The problem, each drum would weigh over 2,000 tons once loaded. The Navy said no ship could carry such a monster. So they built new ships. They called them conundrums, floating reels the size of buildings. Welders, carpenters, and naval engineers worked side by side in secret docks, watched over by armed guards. To curious civilians, they said these were experimental mine barriers. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Meanwhile, American engineers studied the British designs, adapting them for their own fuel networks in the Pacific. It was the first truly combined engineering war, a collaboration between nations, forged not by speeches but by blueprints and burn marks. Inside the planning rooms, a single question dominated every meeting: could the Germans detect it? The answer had to be no. The pipes would be laid under cover of darkness, disguised by decoy operations along the coast. Their ends would vanish into fake telephone huts on the English side, and into buried tanks on the French coast once the invasion succeeded. "Even the seagulls can't know," said one admiral grimly. By spring 1944, after nearly a year of work, both the HAIS and Hamel pipelines were ready. Engineers ran the final pressure tests in Portsmouth Harbor. When the valves opened, the line shuddered, then the fuel began to move, thick and golden, humming through steel veins. Men watched in silence as the gauge needles climbed, steady and strong. A cheer broke out, cautious but real. For the first time, they could see the future flowing. A young naval officer sent a coded telegram that night: "The snake is alive." But even success came with dread. The invasion was only weeks away. If the Germans spotted the conundrums or traced the cable routes, the entire plan, and the armies that depended on it, would be lost. Archibald Fraser stood by the docks, watching one of the massive reels being lowered onto its barge. "We've done our part," he said quietly. "Now the sea decides." The sky was gray, the horizon calm, as if holding its breath. Somewhere across that water waited an occupied continent, and beneath it soon, a secret artery that could feed a war. The men left the docks that night exhausted but trembling with something new. Not pride, not yet. Just the fragile belief that the impossible might actually float. And as the first conundrum slipped from its moorings, creaking under its colossal weight, someone whispered the words that would haunt them all. "Tomorrow, we lay it under fire." No one spoke above a whisper that night. The docks of Portsmouth were cloaked in fog, the kind that swallowed sound and men alike. Orders came in short bursts, coded and cold. Engines ready. Lights out. No smoking on deck. Even the sea seemed to listen. On the horizon, shapes emerged, vast, round silhouettes rising from the mist like giants. The conundrums. Each was a floating drum of steel, nearly 30 feet tall, wound tight with miles of pipe that gleamed under the faint light of a half-moon. Inside those coils lay the bloodstream of an army. A young petty officer watched one sway as it was tugged toward open water. "Looks like the world's biggest yo-yo," he muttered. His captain replied, "If it snaps, it'll take half the channel with it." It was June 1944. The invasion of Normandy had begun. Allied soldiers were pushing inland, but their fuel ships were still trapped behind destroyed ports and mined beaches. Every hour, tanks were burning their last gallons. The word Pluto now meant more than an experiment. It meant survival. The first mission, codenamed Operation Bambi, would attempt to unroll 70 miles of HIS pipeline from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, under a sea mined, patrolled, and still reeking of battle. The convoy moved out just after midnight. No lights. No radio. Only the deep pulse of engines and the creak of steel under strain. The men aboard weren't soldiers but engineers, sailors, and technicians, a strange army armed with wrenches and depth charts instead of rifles. Below deck, they monitored pressure gauges as the reel began to turn. The pipe slid into the sea, unspooling smoothly, sinking beneath the waves. On the surface, the water rippled, then stilled. For a moment, it seemed to work perfectly. Then the wind rose. A sudden gust rocked the lead ship, snapping a securing cable. The conundrum jerked violently, steel grinding against steel. One of the crew yelled, "Hold her steady." Sparks flew as the machinery fought the pull of the tide. For 30 seconds, no one breathed. If the pipe snapped, the entire project would fail in a single heartbeat. But the tension eased. The line held. The ship's engines roared, correcting course. When dawn broke, the convoy was still moving, slow, deliberate, ghost-like. From the French coast, German lookouts watched the gray horizon but saw nothing unusual. Just fishing boats, perhaps, or debris from the invasion. They didn't know that beneath them, an invisible artery was threading its way across the seabed. By nightfall, the first section of pipeline had reached the shallow waters near Cherbourg. Divers in heavy suits descended to guide the final link into its concrete cradle. One described it later as trying to thread a needle while bombs fall overhead. The work continued for 3 days. Storms rolled in, delaying the final connection. At one point, a German reconnaissance plane passed overhead. The men froze in place, waiting for the scream of bombs. None came. The cloud saved them. On the 4th night, under driving rain, the last joint was sealed. The signal was sent to England, ready to pump. In a small coastal pumping station disguised as a farmhouse, engineers opened the valves. The pipes trembled as pressure built. Gauges flickered. Somewhere deep under the channel, the line shivered, and then began to flow. From Cherbourg came the reply, "Fuel received. Pressure steady." The first 1,000 gallons of Allied gasoline crossed the ocean unseen. The men in the control room stared at the gauges, hardly daring to believe it. One officer whispered, "We've just done what the Navy couldn't, we've crossed the channel without leaving the surface." Within weeks, Pluto expanded into a network. More lines were laid, Bambi from the Isle of Wight, Dumbo from Dungeness. Together they carried millions of liters of fuel per day. From England's hidden pumping stations to France's advancing front lines, a silent current sustained the Allied push toward Germany. But the sea still took its toll. One night, a section ruptured near mid-channel, spewing thousands of gallons into the black water. The crew tried to patch it from deck, working in freezing wind and waves high enough to drown a man. A sailor was swept overboard. They never found him. Later, a report listed the loss as minor leakage. The men who'd been there called it what it was, the sea's toll. Still, the operation continued. As the front moved east, Pluto followed, its pumping stations leapfrogging through liberated towns. German prisoners who stumbled upon the buried pipes were ordered to dig them out, not knowing that the fuel running above their heads would soon power the tanks chasing them. By autumn, over 1 million gallons a day flowed through the underwater lines. The supply lines once strangled by distance now pulsed like veins through the body of Europe. In London, an admiral raised a glass and said simply, "To the engineers who conquered the sea." But the men who'd done it never used words like conquer. They knew better. They'd felt the weight of that water pressing on their creation, testing every joint, every weld, every nerve. One of them wrote home. "We fought no battles. We just kept the fuel flowing. But when the tanks reached Paris, we knew, the war had rolled there through our hands. The pipeline had survived its first crossing. But no one knew how long it would last, or how far it could stretch. Because the next objective was already on the map, the heart of Germany itself. And Pluto would have to follow. Every gallon that passed through Pluto was somebody's life. We knew it. We just couldn't tell anyone." Voice of an American supply technician, recorded in 1945. The front lines were moving fast now, too fast. Patton's armored divisions tore through the French countryside, engines roaring, dust clouds rising like ghosts of old villages. The soldiers sang, the newsreels shouted of victory, of liberation. But beneath all the celebration, another sound hummed quietly, the low, constant thrum of pumps pushing fuel through steel veins under the sea. At the edge of a field outside Cherbourg, a small team of technicians kept watch over a cluster of squat concrete huts disguised as barns. Inside, the air reeked of gasoline and hot metal. Pumps pounded in rhythm, steady, mechanical heartbeats. Each pulse pushed thousands of gallons through the Pluto lines from England to the French coast. One of the men, Sergeant Alan Brooks from Ohio, marked each hour on a clipboard. "Pressure steady," he murmured. It wasn't glamorous work, but he knew what it meant. "If this stops," he told a new recruit, "every tank between here and Paris stops with it." At night, they stood outside in the dark, listening. The only sound was the faint hiss of the pipeline buried beneath their boots. Sometimes, a sudden change in tone, a sharper hiss, a deeper throb, would freeze them all. They could tell by ear when something was wrong. In late July, during one of those night watches, the hum faltered. The pressure gauge dropped. Then again. Silence. Brooks turned to his radio operator. "Call Portsmouth. We're losing flow." The line crackled. "Stand by." Hours passed. The entire team stayed awake, pacing, waiting for the pumps to come back to life. The silence felt unbearable, as though the war itself had stopped breathing. "If this is sabotage," one of them whispered, "we're blind." In Portsmouth, British engineers scrambled to trace the problem. Was it a German mine? A severed section? Panic spread through the control room as needle after needle dropped to zero. Then, at dawn, one operator shouted, "Found it. Airlock in line 2. A trapped bubble, a pocket of air caught somewhere in the pipeline, had halted the flow. The fix was brutal and simple: overpressure the line until the bubble burst. It was a dangerous gamble, too much pressure could rip the pipe apart. But there was no choice. They cranked the pumps to maximum. The gauges rattled. The floor vibrated. And then, with a deep metallic groan, the line cleared. In Cherbourg, the first rush of fuel came roaring through again. The technicians cheered, pounding each other on the back. "Pluto's breathing again," someone shouted. By August, the pipeline network, Bambi from the Isle of Wight and Dumbo from Dungeness, was running at full capacity. More than 1 million liters of gasoline a day flowed across the channel, feeding everything from jeeps to Spitfires. The soldiers at the front had no idea where the fuel came from. They just knew it arrived, steady, constant, like a miracle. Convoys rolled east, tanks surged forward, the liberation of Paris began. In a report to London, an officer wrote, "The flow is uninterrupted. Every drop from Pluto reaches the fight." In the cafés of newly liberated towns, soldiers toasted with French wine, while far behind them, engineers sat in the dark beside humming pumps, drinking bitter coffee and watching dials. The war's glamour was elsewhere, the glory, the headlines, but they knew the truth. "Wars aren't won by bullets," Brooks said once, staring at the spinning needle of a gauge. "They're won by the fuel that lets the bullets move." The longer the front advanced, the harder their work became. The pipeline stretched further inland, connected to new depots, new tanker routes. Every additional mile meant more pressure, more risk. And the sea, the same sea that had hidden them, began to turn against them. By late August, storms raged across the channel. Waves slammed into the coastlines, tearing at underwater joints. The pump strained to keep the flow alive. One by one, sections began to fail. At headquarters, an aide handed the situation report to a weary colonel: "Pressure drop in line 3, unknown cause. Weather preventing repair ships from launch." The colonel stared out the window at the rain hammering the glass. "If we lose that line," he said quietly, "we lose momentum." On the beaches, the wind screamed through the remnants of D-Day's fortifications. The ocean didn't care who it fed, or who it starved. That night, as another wave of rain swept across the channel, the control panels in Portsmouth flickered red. Tension fell to zero. One of the engineers looked up, face pale. "We've lost the line." No one spoke. Somewhere out in that dark, angry water, the artery of victory had gone silent. The pumps slowed, the hum died, and for the first time since the invasion, Pluto was no longer breathing. But the next order was already coming through the static: repair teams to sea. Find the break. Whatever it takes. Because if the lifeblood of the war stopped now, so would everything else. The storm arrived like a hammer. Wind battered the channel and turned the beaches into sheets of moving glass. In Portsmouth, the lights flickered across the control room, illuminating rows of trembling needles. Then, one by one, the gauges dropped to zero. Pressure's gone, someone whispered. The hum that had kept the Allied front alive vanished, leaving only the sound of rain striking the windows like distant artillery. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the order, smudged by seawater, handed from one oil-stained palm to another: repair teams to sea. Mines or no mines. The men didn't argue. They simply pulled on heavy coats, grabbed their toolkits, and walked into the night. The repair ship Retriever rolled in the swell as she cleared the harbor wall. Her deck smelled of diesel, salt, and fear. A single conundrum coil groaned against its mountings, ready to feed fresh pipe into the sea. The petty officer in charge said quietly, "We'll find the break by touch." Nobody answered. There was nothing comforting to say. The search began at first light. The sky was a flat, bruised gray, the sea a restless mirror. Grapnels dragged across the seabed, their cables singing through the winches. The men counted out cable lengths with chalk marks on the rail, a ritual against panic. When one of the hooks caught on something solid, the ship lurched sideways. "Hold her steady," the captain shouted. The cable strained, then went slack. Not the pipeline. Just a ghost from an older wreck. Hours passed. The storm built again, wind shrieking across the deck. A wave swept over the quarterdeck, knocking two sailors against the rail. The youngest one laughed breathlessly, laughter born of exhaustion more than courage. At last, a thin rainbow shimmered across the water, a slick of gasoline rising from below. "We've got it," someone said. The captain turned the ship into the wind. Divers suited up in heavy copper helmets, their boots weighted with lead. One crossed himself before stepping over the side. Underwater, the world was green and blind. A diver's gloved hands felt along the pipe, following it into darkness. When his palm met a jagged edge, he tugged the signal line twice, found the break. The repair sleeve descended like a coffin. The men worked by touch and faith, their tools slipping in the current. A sergeant from Texas wedged his shoulder under a loose flange until the bolts caught. When they surfaced hours later, pale and trembling, one of them whispered, "She's whole again." Back in Portsmouth, the pumps waited. Patton's tanks had already begun to stall on the far side of France. Fuel convoys were stranded on muddy roads, engines dead. "We have road, we have men," came the radio call. "But we do not have movement." On the repair ship, the captain received the signal, "Begin pumping test." The engineers reopened the valves. For a long moment, nothing. Then the deck beneath them trembled. The line shivered, and roared back to life. Fuel rushed beneath the sea once more. Cheers erupted. Someone slapped the control panel and shouted, "She's breathing again." But 6 hours later, the gauges dipped a second time. Another section had ruptured. The sea, relentless and indifferent, had struck back. In London, a colonel read the new report, the words blurred by fatigue, "Line Bambi compromised. Weather extreme." He drew a pencil mark under the final line and muttered, "Build another. Shorter, stronger." Within a day, the plan was in motion: Dumbo, a new route from Dungeness to Boulogne. On England's southern coast, welders worked beneath canvas tarps that snapped in the wind. Trains carried steel coils through bombed-out towns. At Boulogne, French villagers watched as engineers landed the first drums of pipe, painting the shore huts to look like farmhouses. Children waved, officers paid them in chocolate to stay away. When Dumbo finally opened, the flow steadied almost instantly, faster, stronger, as if the sea itself had grown tired of the fight. In the Cherbourg pump house, men exhaled for the first time in days. A telegram reached headquarters, "Throughput restored." The colonel who read it lit a cigarette and said quietly, protect the line from the sea as you would from the enemy. By September, Patton's columns were moving again. The tanks drank deep, the trucks rolled, the sky filled with fuel-fed thunder. Yet the men who made it possible would remain nameless, working through fog and tide, listening to the heartbeat of machines beneath the waves. One of them wrote home, "The sea doesn't hate us. It just wants to remind us who's stronger." That night, as another squall rattled the windows of the Cherbourg station, the supervisor lowered his voice. "We guard it from the Germans," he said, "and from God himself." The pumps kept beating. For now, the sea was quiet. But the engineers knew better than to trust silence. Because somewhere in the darkness, a new order was already being written, stamped most secret, and Pluto's next challenge was waiting just beyond the horizon. We marched past metal drums stacked on the beach and thought they were cable or junk. We didn't know that under our boots ran our own lifeline. Voice of an American tanker, summer 1945. By autumn 1944, the pipeline had become invisible, not just beneath the sea, but inside the war itself. It fed the front like a secret artery, one no one was allowed to mention. Thousands of soldiers filled their jeeps, their trucks, their tanks, without ever asking where the fuel came from. The answer was classified, stamped most secret, buried under 1,000 feet of water and silence. In a small operations hut near Dungeness, British engineers monitored the pressure gauges through the night. Their world was reduced to dials, valves, and the soft, rhythmic throb of pumps. A notice on the wall read, "Loose talk costs lives and fuel." Outside, wind swept across the coast, but inside they could almost hear the liquid heartbeat of the war. Each man signed a vow of secrecy. Even their families didn't know what they did. Letters home spoke only of coastal maintenance. One technician joked that his wife thought he was repairing lighthouses. The truth was that he kept an army alive. From Dungeness, the Dumbo line carried millions of liters each day through steel and lead veins that snaked across the channel to Boulogne and then deeper into France. From there, the gasoline flowed to depots and convoys, through a network that stretched over 500 kilometers. It powered trucks, tanks, and bombers from Normandy to the German border. In December 1944, during the Ardennes offensive, the pipeline became critical. The cold froze fuel trucks and made roads impassable. Pluto never stopped. Beneath the storm, it pumped without rest, a quiet pulse under a world tearing itself apart. "We didn't shoot, but every bullet fired owed us one drop," said Sergeant Alan Brooks, one of the early engineers. Yet most of the army never knew he existed. When supply officers sent reports to Supreme Headquarters, the words, "pipeline under the ocean," were replaced with the vague phrase, "special transport system." Even Eisenhower's staff discussed it in code. The general himself, in a speech after the liberation of Paris, thanked the silent men who kept the wheels turning, and moved on. Inside the pump houses, that silence was real. Night after night, the same crew stood watch, listening to the growl of machinery and the distant thunder of war on the radio. Some drew chalk marks on the wall for each million gallons passed. By February 1945, the tally had become unreadable, the whole wall was gray. There were near disasters. A valve explosion at the Boulogne terminal tore through a storage hut, sending flames 50 feet into the air. The men extinguished it before it reached the main line. A German U-boat, prowling the channel, fired torpedoes at what it thought was a supply convoy, decoys hiding Pluto's ships. The torpedoes missed. The sea stayed silent. When the war began to tilt toward its end, the engineers realized they might never be named. One of them, Captain William Fraser of Shell, wrote in his diary, "Our work will be dismantled, our names forgotten, but the front will remember in speed." In April 1945, the fuel reached as far as the Rhine. The tanks crossing into Germany carried Pluto's breath in their engines. The final figures were staggering, more than 170 million gallons delivered since D-Day, enough to move every Allied vehicle from Normandy to Berlin and back again. And yet, not one newspaper printed the word, pipeline. Even as crowds in London cheered victory, the men who had built and maintained it stayed invisible, their achievements buried under official secrecy. To the world, the war had been won by soldiers, pilots, and generals. But those who listened to the pumps every night knew better. Wars aren't just fought with courage, one of them said years later. They're fought with pressure, the kind that keeps fuel flowing through steel when the world tries to break it. When Germany finally surrendered, the orders came swiftly: shut down the line. No mention in the press. The pumps stopped, the pressure bled away, and for the first time in nearly a year, the huts on the coast were silent. The engineers packed up their tools, saluted the machines, and walked out into the wind. No medals. No parades. Only the knowledge that they had built something no one else even knew existed. The war was over, but the secret wasn't. Pluto would remain classified for more than a decade, its story sealed in archives, waiting for a time when the sea would finally give it back. 20 years after the war, the sea still hid its secret. On a gray morning in 1965, a group of retired engineers stood on the shingle beach near Shanklin on the Isle of Wight. The tide was low, the air heavy with salt and rust. Out in the surf, something curved and metallic broke the waves, a length of pipe, barnacled and half-buried, still breathing faintly with trapped air. One of the men, his hair the color of the channel mist, stepped forward and touched the corroded steel. "She's still here," he said quietly. "After all the storms." Another nodded, not trusting his voice. They had spent their youth fighting time and tide to keep that pipe alive, and now the sea had returned it to them, not as wreckage, but as proof. After the war, Pluto had been erased from public maps. The lines that once carried life to the front were dismantled or abandoned to the water. Between 1949 and 1952, salvage crews hauled miles of lead-sheathed cable onto barges, selling it for scrap. But they never found it all. Some of the pipes refused to die. They sank deeper, welded by pressure and sand, becoming fossils of a war fought in silence. In the early 60s, when the government finally declassified the files, newspapers ran headlines that sounded almost unreal: "Pipeline under the ocean, Britain's secret weapon." The public stared at the photos of giant steel reels, of divers in copper helmets, of the strange name, Pluto, and asked, why didn't we know? The veterans didn't answer. Most had spent 2 decades pretending it had never happened. They were engineers, not soldiers, and the world rarely built monuments for those who worked in shadows. But invitations began to arrive: lectures, reunions, a ceremony at Shanklin. They came quietly, wearing old uniforms that no longer fit, their medals few and modest. That day, as they gathered by the sea, the Royal Navy Band played softly over the wind. A small plaque was unveiled. Here began the pipeline under the ocean, 1944–45. It carried the fuel of freedom. An old naval officer, his hands shaking from age, gave the speech. "We built this to win a war," he said, "but we remember it to remind ourselves what invention can do when courage has no witnesses." For a long moment afterward, no one spoke. The gulls wheeled above them, and the tide reached the first barnacled pipe, washing over it with a hollow sound, like breath through a lung long at rest. Across the channel, at Boulogne, another ceremony took place. French fishermen who had seen the engineers work during the war now stood beside them. They shared bread, photographs, and silence. A French mayor said simply, "Without what lay beneath the water, we might still be waiting for liberation." In the years that followed, historians began to call Pluto the most ambitious engineering project of the war, a feat rivaling radar or the Mulberry Harbors. But those who had built it knew it was never about glory. It was about keeping men moving, about making sure that when tanks reached the edge of the world, the fuel was already waiting. Decades later, divers found sections of the old pipe still intact on the seabed. They said that when you tapped it, the echo traveled far, as if the sea itself remembered what had flowed through it. Captain William Fraser, one of the last surviving engineers, visited the Shanklin Memorial in 1970. He stood by the plaque, watching the waves crawl over the stones. A reporter asked if he thought Pluto had changed the war. Fraser smiled faintly. No, he said. It changed the way we fight them. We learned that victory doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it comes with pressure, steady, unseen, unstoppable. He turned back to the horizon where the sky met the channel, a thin gray line of memory. She's still down there, he murmured. Still holding. The sea, patient as ever, answered with another small wave. Today, pieces of Pluto remain scattered along the coast, twisted sections of steel half buried in sand, silent memorials to men who built a miracle they could never speak of. When the tide is right, you can still hear the faint hum of the pumps that once beat beneath the world's greatest battle. Or maybe it's just the wind, carrying the sound of a war that ended long ago but never quite left the water. Because some things the sea doesn't wash away. It keeps them, not out of vengeance, but memory. And somewhere, beneath the gray waves of the channel, the old line still lies curled like a vein in the earth, a relic of steel and salt, waiting in the dark, the quiet proof that even silence can carry a war to victory.